The Chinese Grand Prix is back, and here's everything to watch for from each of the teams for this first sprint race weekend of the 2024 season. Before we get started, just want to remind you to like, subscribe, and follow at the Pitwall Pod. Really means a lot to us. And also just want to apologize for not having a Japanese Grand Prix video. Me and Dawson were just too busy to meet up, so today I'm going to do a little bit of a hybrid between the little sit-down videos that I do here and a podcast just kind of by myself to talk to you about the stuff that we should be looking forward at the Grand Prix coming up this weekend. So in no particular order, let's start with Williams. I think Williams is just trying to survive this weekend. I mean, really, the fact that they're still coming with basically only 2 chassis, maybe some extra spare parts, hopefully, so maybe they could mend some if they needed to. But the fact that Logan Sargent, he's not going to get a good opportunity at any point to prove himself until they have a spare chassis, because he's probably going to drive a little too careful, a little too cautiously, and I would be very surprised if he scored points. And honestly, this Alex Albon crashing streak, if you want to call it that, is both kind of surprising, but also we've seen this before from him when he was back at Red Bull. So, you know, it's not exactly unheard of that he has a rough patch in his career, and if you can even call it that, it's still very early in the season. But I think this is a very crucial time in the championship for Williams. I mean, it's a sprint race weekend. It's a track that neither driver has driven at Williams. Logan's never driven it at all, and that's very significant. And there's a couple drivers across the grid that's either their only second time driving this race or their first time. So that's a big deal. And the fact that they have to get in setup range in one practice with 2 different chassis that they're not used to driving, and then they have 2 weeks, and then they have to do it in Miami again with another sprint race. One crash could significantly cripple their development for the rest of the season, not to mention the cost and the cost cap and just Williams' budget alone. I don't even think the cost cap is actually the problem. It's just the fact that Williams doesn't have money. Like, they haven't always had money, and they're doing a lot better now. But either way, continually crashing is not ideal for the rest of the season for Williams. Let's talk about Sauber, Stake, whatever you want to call them. While one of their main goals, obviously, is just to not continually have terrible pit stops, so maybe they could actually see what their genuine race pace and finishing positions would be. But also, obviously, I think this is a huge weekend for Zhou Guanyu, and whether or not he performs super well, obviously, there is a sizable fan base that is really excited to see Zhou Guanyu at his first home race, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of sponsorship activations. I'm sure he's very excited, and overall, I mean, they do no harm to me personally, so I'm just very excited to see Zhou have his first home race weekend and just see how it goes. Let's talk about Haas. The Haas delusion syndrome is alive and well. They've been scoring points when they normally don't. AO is bringing updates pretty soon, and they said they want to have massive upgrades throughout the season. Now, as we all know, Haas tends to underdevelop or develop backwards throughout the season, so I'm hoping that's not the case, because Haas is really impressing me this season. They're basically like the 6th fastest-ish team right now. It's kind of muddy down there in the mid-lower field. I'm hoping they bring some updates this weekend. We don't know for sure, but we do know they're coming. Alpine, man, there's just not a lot to talk about. I would just say Alpine's goal this weekend is probably just not to look absolutely terrible. Maybe get into Q2 another time. We'll see, man, but they are just not looking good, and I think that they're just trying to retain either of their drivers as they're both looking out to somewhere else. I just think this is a very tense time, and this team could totally fall apart and be in big trouble. I mean, I've heard rumors of, oh, maybe someone's going to try and buy them out. Andretti, maybe. Not that he needs a base in France. But overall, Alpine just needs to not look terrible this weekend, I think, is their goal, and hopefully some updates are on the way. This is a weird time of year where we don't really know when teams are going to start bringing their updates. A lot of them try and wait till after Imola, but as these sprint races come up, like, valuable points are being left behind. So it's a weird situation where I feel like at any point we could start seeing some pretty significant upgrades from any team, and we all know Alpine needs it. I don't even know what to say Red Bull's goal is this weekend. Another 1-2, I think, is like bare minimum at this point. Overall, I think Red Bull is just looking to continue their dominant streak as long as it can go. And I think anything behind not winning both sprint races and having a 1-2 or either of them isn't like a failure. I mean, you can't call that a failure of a weekend, but I think their only ambition is to just continue maximum points. Once again, it's continued clutch time for Checo and trying to figure out who's the second seat for them going next year. But I think at the end of the day, Red Bull wants Checo to succeed because that's just the easiest decision for them, even though there are lots of other great drivers lingering out there. And with this Red Bull story comes RB, their sister, baby, junior team, whatever they're calling them these days. There's another weird situation going on at RB, which I think is one of the biggest storylines of the season, which is Daniel Ricciardo was expected to come in, absolutely destroy Yuki, and move up to Big Red Bull once again. And that is not happening. Daniel Ricciardo is supposed to get a new chassis this weekend, if not next weekend, next race weekend in Miami. And I think this is a crucial time for Daniel Ricciardo because right now, it went from looking like he was going to be the shoo-in for the Red Bull seat to now he might not even have a seat mid-season, possibly. There's all these rumors that they might pull him for Liam Lawson, which would just be crazy because that just happened the other way around. And we all know how these Red Bull driver moves go. So anyway, it's time for Daniel Ricciardo to get his stuff together and beat Yuki, or at least perform on the same level as Yuki, because Yuki's absolutely destroying him. And while there's no evidence to support this, I just don't think Yuki is their long-term guy, especially because I think Honda's interested in him moving forward to potentially go to Aston Martin if there's ever a seat open for him. And I think right now, Red Bull, proper Big Red Bull, is just picking between three different drivers: Checo, Daniel Ricciardo, and Liam Lawson. And if you had to rank which is more likely at this point, Daniel Ricciardo is definitely below the other two, which is just crazy to say right now. Aston Martin also has an interesting storyline about to kind of develop right now. First of all, Fernando Alonso re-signed, and he's going to continue driving there, which I think was all kind of a surprise to us. I don't think all of us were necessarily expecting him to sign, especially not that early, especially because I think he possibly could have been in contention for either the Mercedes or the Red Bull seat. But I mean, maybe he didn't want to drive next to Max, and maybe he doesn't trust how terrible Mercedes has been lately, and this was the best option for him. Not to mention, I'm pretty sure Daddy Stroll is throwing a ton of money at him to be an ambassador in the future and help continue the team on in a semi-team principal advisor situation. Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, Aston, their main goal is to actually develop the season. Last season, they couldn't do that. And also, I think it's just time for them to clear up whether or not Lance is going to stay or not, because like I just mentioned, Yuki obviously is lingering out there as a potential Honda candidate when Aston Martin becomes Honda engine powered in a couple years. I just think it's weird that Fernando Alonso is signing on when Lance Stroll is arguably one of the lower performing drivers on the grid. Alonso signing on is almost kind of like knowing that he's going to have to win a championship by himself. Anyway, lots going on at Aston Martin. They need to improve their car. Fernando Alonso re-signs, and we need to see what's going to happen if Lance is going to stay for sure. McLaren this weekend, this is going to be a tough track for McLaren, I think. There's long straights. They're not exactly great in slow, medium speed corners, it seems. And not to mention, this track is high degradation, and they only have one practice to get in the window. And Oscar Piastri's main weakness is tire degradation, and he's never driven here before. Like, it's piling up. I don't anticipate this being a great track for McLaren, but if they can still be semi-competitive, that's a great sign for them going forward. And maybe they'll be able to use this data as a way to improve for some super slow speed cornering races coming up, like Monaco. Maybe the Hungaroring could be benefited from this race. So McLaren, I think, is a data collection and survive in advance weekend. Let's talk about Ferrari. Obviously, Carlos Sainz is a big name right now, looking to continue his streak of dominance, because even though I mentioned the three drivers of contention that are in the Red Bull family right now for the Red Bull seat, if you ask me right now, I would say Carlos Sainz is going to Red Bull next year, and I don't think they're going to sign him anytime soon, so it's going to be whether or not Carlos Sainz is willing to wait. But Ferrari, I think they're just going to kind of use this weekend to prove that their car is versatile at a lot of tracks. I don't know if this is necessarily like the best testing track ever, the best prove-it track ever, but it's also interesting because Leclerc's only driven this track twice, and only one time was in a Ferrari. So it's going to be a really interesting experience to watch these two teammates, because Carlos Sainz has never driven this race at a Ferrari. So it's like, there's a lot that could go on. There's a lot of storylines that could happen. And I think I'm kind of confused what their pace is going to be on a track like this. And who knows? They could surprise us. And finally, the team that I think needs to improve the most, the fastest, is Mercedes. Mercedes are having maybe their worst season in their history right now. Maybe not technically, but I would say expectations versus reality. They are having so much problem with their simulator. Their car is just bad. I mean, let's just leave it at that. Their car's bad. But with all of that said, this track actually has some potential for them to show some improvement. I am not expecting a podium at all, so do not think I'm saying that. I'm just talking about improvement here. I think their straight line speed could be a benefit to them this weekend. I think that both of the drivers are pretty decent tire managers, and Lewis is a really good tire manager. He's obviously driven this track a lot, and George Russell's never driven this track in a Mercedes, so that's a factor too. There's a lot less high-speed cornering on this track, which has been their biggest weakness thus far. And it's supposed to be rainy weather / cooler temperatures. And it seems like Mercedes can perform when the temperatures are cool, but when the temperatures go up, Mercedes are just done. So maybe with all of those factors, they can show some potentially top 5 range improvement. Again, not great considering that I think they thought they were going to have a championship challenge when they created this car. And right now, I mean, they're barely scraping by Aston, and McLaren has passed them, and Ferrari has passed them. So it's not looking good. And finally, obviously, this is a sprint race weekend in a new format. So just to remind you how the format goes now, there's a practice on Friday, a sprint qualifying on Friday, then there's the sprint first thing on Saturday, and then qualifying for the Grand Prix is after that, and then the race on Sunday. They've made it really unclear whether or not you can make changes between the sprint race and qualifying for the Grand Prix. I think you should be able to. I don't really think there's a downside to doing that because it can only make the Grand Prix more interesting. But the fact that we haven't heard anything leads me to believe that they haven't changed Parc Fermé rules any, and you can't make any setup changes, which again, I think is a real shame because you could just kind of use the sprint race as a test and then potentially have a better Grand Prix with a different order. And there's a different qualifying. So again, it could be a lot more interesting. And I think going forward, if F1 doesn't allow Parc Fermé to open back up between the end of sprint and qualifying, then, I mean, this format's only a little bit better. At least qualifying ends Saturday, but I think that's what they should do. And that's about it. Let me know who you think are going to perform best in China. Please like, subscribe, follow at the Pitwall Pod, and I'll see you on the next one.